So, good morning to everyone. The study I present today is the result of a joint work, as been already said, with Luciano Covi and Chiara Tamanini from IPRASE. And the focus and the aim of this presentation is to focus on vocational and training courses in Trentino. The relevance of focusing on this topic is due to the fact that in 2009, Trentino changed the organization of the upper secondary education into three main branches, so general school, technical school, and vocational and training courses, by gradually suppressing the vocational schools. And the aim of this change was to impact positively on students' orientation in order to reduce early school leavers. In the light of this, starting from the school year 2012-2013, thanks to an agreement between the province of Trento, INVALSI, and IPRASE, all the students enrolled in vocational and training courses are involved in the Italian and mathematics INVALSI tests. So the change in the structure of the upper secondary education is well represented by this graph. So this graph will show the share of students enrolled in the upper secondary education by school tracks over time in the province of Trento. As we can see, starting from the school year 2010-2012, we can see a decrease in the share of students enrolled in vocational school, which is the yellow lines, that has been counterbalanced by an increase in the share of students enrolled in general and technical school, but especially in the share of students enrolled in vocational and training courses, which is the gray line, which reached the share of 30% of students enrolled in the first year of the upper secondary education. If we compare this with the national context, it becomes relevant the peculiarity of the Trentino educational system. And the remarkable difference here lies exactly in the fact that the highest share of students enrolled in vocational and training courses, so almost 30% in the province of Trento, and the national context, which is around 16% of the students enrolled in vocational schools. So, given this context, we use INVALSI data to shed light on such an important branch of the Trentino educational system in two distinct ways. We first look at the differences in terms of performance between different programs in the province of Trento, and then we compare the vocational and training courses in the province of Trento with the national context, vocational school at the national level. And then in the second part, we focus on the transition from lower to upper secondary education, taking into account the role of previous performance, so at grade 8, considering also the role of students' social background. So we first look at the differences between programs in terms of performance in the province of Trento. These two figures, I don't know if you can see, that show the differences, the results in terms of performance between different programs. In the figure on the left, we have the results for Italian, and the figure on the right, the results for mathematics. This graph shows the results for the same students at grade 8 and at grade 10. And as we may expect, students show consistent differences according to their upper secondary education choices. And in general, as we may expect, of course, students with the highest score tend to enroll more in general schools than in other tracks, and this is more evident for the Italian and less evident for mathematics, where also students enrolled in technical school show very high scores. However, what is more interesting for the purpose of this talk is to show that students from vocational and training courses reduce the gap from grade 8 to grade 10 with general and technical schools. This is true for the Italian test, while for mathematics, the gap between vocational and training courses and the other two programs remains quite large. Then we compare the results of vocational and training courses with the national context, And given the differences in the organizational structure of the upper secondary education at the national level, we decided to compare vocational and training courses with vocational schools at the national level. So the results basically shows that we can compare, that vocational and training courses are fully comparable with vocational schools at the national levels, and that in particular, that in 2019, the results from the vocational and training course in Trentino show higher scores compared to vocational school in the Northeast, the red column, and Italy with the blue column. So, given this scenario, the second part of this presentation focuses on the transition from lower to upper secondary education. And we take into account the role of previous performance at grade 8 and how this may shape the decision of upper secondary education, taking also into account the role of social background. Why the transition to upper secondary education? Because it's a key passage for individuals' future occupational outcomes, as in Italy, this is also a significant influence by the type of education acquired. As we all know, in Italy, children of high-educated families are more likely to enroll in general schools and therefore are more likely to undertake and completely successfully complete the school career, the more rewarding school careers. So, given the differences that we observed that we saw before between different programs, we decided to focus on the transition from upper secondary education, considering together the role of previous performance and the social background of the students. Of course, analyzing a context such as the province of Trent, which is a small reality in the national level, we think that could represent an important contribution, and we have also some important insights also at the national level. So this figure shows the result of predictive probabilities from multinomial logistic regression with an interaction between performance at grade 8 and parental education. So here we can see on the x-axis we have performance in the Italian score, on the y-axis we have probability, and then we have different models separately for males and females. So in the first two is the probability to choose the general schools, then here we have technical schools for males and females, and here we have the transition to training, vocational and training courses. The three different lines show that the solid line represents students with tertiary educated parents, while the dashed line represents students with upper secondary, whose parents have upper secondary education, and the dotted line represents students whose parents have lower secondary education. So, as we can see, for all groups and for boys and girls, higher test scores means a higher probability to enroll in general school and lower probability to enroll in vocational and training courses. However, what is interesting here is that social disparities between these three lines becomes even larger among top performing students. So, for example, here among low performing students we have a small gap between different social students with different social origins. So around, for instance, the probability to enroll in a general school if you have tertiary educated parents are more or less 20%, while if you have parents with a lower education, it's equal to around 10%. But the differences becomes even larger if we are looking at top performing students. So the gap between these three lines becomes even larger. So, for instance, among top performing students, the probability for students whose parents have tertiary education is around 80–90% to enroll in a general school. But for students with the exactly same test score, the probability, if the parents have a lower secondary education, it's around 40–50% to enroll. We are talking about the same student with the exactly same test score. However, for females, the pattern is very similar. However, females tend to enroll, are more likely to enroll in general school rather than in the technical track. If we look at the probability to choose the vocational and training courses, we see that among top-performing students, there's little differences between, depending according to the social origins. However, if we consider students with an average score, so around 200, the difference it's quite relevant, because we going through a less than 10% for students whose parents are tertiary educated, and to 30% of students whose parents has a lower secondary education. The technical track here showed very small difference among low-performing students, so there are no difference between these three lines. And while, if we are looking at top-performing students, the students whose parents have lower secondary education, so a much higher probability to enroll in a technical track. So the pattern is very similar, as you can see from this slide transition. It's very similar. The only difference is that among top-performing students whose parents have lower secondary education, there are much higher probability for males to enroll in technical track rather than in general school. So if you are looking here, there's a 30% among top-performing students to enroll in general school, and almost 60%, 50–60% to enroll in technical track. Overall, we compare also this result with previous contribution at the national level, and we can say that social inequality show the same magnitude at the Italian level as well as in the province of Trento. So social inequalities are still there, and are still shape the educational choice in the upper secondary education. So to conclude, we focus on the vocational and training courses in Trentino because they represent a very large component of the upper secondary education. And although we observe differences in terms of performance between programs, we also observe that from grade 8 to grade 10, vocational and training courses reduce the gap from with general and technical schools. And they also might be, these are to underline how a better student orientation, that was the aim of this reform in the upper secondary education in the province of Trento, might also have an impact or consequences on students' performance. Okay? The students' performance. And it's also, of course, this is far from being a causal effect, but in the period we consider, the early school leavers being reduced from 11.7% in 2012, well below the European Commission goal for 2020, so under 10%, 6.7% in 2018. So we also investigate the transition from lower to upper secondary education, and what we found is that children from less privileged background reduce their gap in the transition to vocational and training courses, but they still display a very large gap in the access and the choice of the transition to general schools. And this might be explained by the fact that children from less privileged background still see the technical education, the vocational track as a less costly and more job-oriented choice compared to the general schools. Recently, some changes in the curricula, such as the introduction in the province of Trento for the 4th and 5th year in the vocational and training courses, as well as the possibility to enroll in the so-called alta formazione, so a tertiary non-academic education, aim to ensure a similar teaching context for all the students, and also the possibility to switch from a school to another in order to reduce the possible consequences of a wrong choices. So in the near future will be, it's needed further research in order to understand better this reform and the impact of this reform, but for the moment these are the results in the situation, and I thank you all for the attention.